Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you to Enlighten, Kitsap, as well as the Kitsap Regional Library and the Kitsap Unitarian Universalist Fellowship for allowing me to first of all, inviting me and then allowing me to utilize the space and with all the technology help as well. So I really appreciate that. Tonight, we're going to talk about goddesses, whores, and women physicians, which is, again, very timely, I think, because we do have a woman nominated as vice president and we have a woman being considered for a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. And we are constantly fighting sort of bias, and I think it's one of those really unconscious things that deserves an evening of discussion. So, let me see there we go. So first of all, a young boy, first we're gonna start with a riddle. A young boy and his father are on their way home from soccer practice when a distracted driver crosses the center line and hits them head on. The father dies at the scene, but the injured boy is transported by ambulance to the hospital and taken into surgery. The on-call surgeon steps out of the operating room and says, "I can't operate on this boy. He's my son." How can this be? If you were even stumped for a second, originally this talk was going to be given in front of a live audience, so I assumed there'd be some shocked faces and some gasps, or some people who knew the answer. But if you even are shocked for a second, then you're basically victim to what's called implicit bias, which is what a lot of gender bias is actually about, and also racial bias, but obviously I'm going to stick to one subject tonight. So again, Good Morning America asked random adults in New York this question, and the majority could not come up with the answer. The answer being obviously that the surgeon is the boy's mother. When they asked fifth graders in Manhattan, however, the same question, the majority of the fifth graders got the answer right. And that's a lot of what we'll talk about tonight, is this pattern of how we see the world because of our own implicit biases. So tonight's objectives would be understand implicit bias, which is a set of ingrained beliefs affecting our unconscious decisions and actions. It comes from the messages, outlook, and principles internalized from the world that we live in. It predicts our behavior, which I think is probably the most salient point of all. And finally, a lot of our implicit biases line up with social hierarchies. Women are judged on their perceived weaknesses. That's kind of a fact, a way of looking at how we view women, whereas men are often judged on their perceived strengths. So that already is a big difference. There's descriptive bias and prescriptive, and that's an important distinction point. The descriptive is about what men and women are, assumptions about who they are or how they are in the world, whereas the prescriptive bias is more about how they should behave. And that's where we start to get in trouble. That's how women get labeled as bossy or domineering in the workplace, because of this mistake or this kind of ingrained prescriptive bias. So in the live audience version of this, which was supposed to be last March, I was going to have everybody close their eyes and form a picture of someone in your mind when I say ferry boat captain, US president, and doctor. And obviously the exercise is not quite as useful here, but I believe that the majority of those would say you pictured men. Maybe you didn't, maybe your mom's a doctor, your daughter's a doctor, your wife is a doctor, and that's great. But we've never had a female US president. And so that clearly would be a picture of a male in your mind. And that's something we need to change. So this is a beautiful picture from the cover of the New Yorker back in April. And what's interesting is the artist is Chris Ware. And it's interesting, he queried his 15-year-old daughter about what he should draw or how he should do the cover for what's considered a health issue of the New Yorker. And she basically said, I wrote it down. She said, make sure it's about how most doctors have children and families of their own. So a 15-year-old girl can see already how important it is that we have this more broad perspective and we understand that there are mothers and fathers that are doctors. And this is a picture of a mother who's working in the hospital during COVID, tucking in her children with their father at home. And it's a paradigm shift, and it's something that we should really make efforts to make sure the world is seeing on a regular basis. So I'm going to turn it over to Jose for a minute because I want him to show you a movie that occurred on this night in December of last year during one of the Democratic presidential debates. Jose?
All right, I will share my screen in a second. And now let's play the video.
I would love to give each of you a copy of my book. And come to think of it, I should probably send my book around more too. We know what a gift it would be to the future and to the country for literally anybody up here to become president of the United States compared to what we've got.
Well, I can give out any one of 4 books that I wrote. But I think the gift that all of us need to give to the American people is a very, very different vision of the reality of the Trump administration.
I will ask for forgiveness. I know that sometimes I get really worked up. And sometimes I get a little hot. I don't really mean to.
I'd ask for forgiveness anytime any of you get mad at me. I can be blunt, but I am doing this because I think it is so important.
All right. So now, Doctor, you will need to share your screen again with your presentation.
No problem. I think I'm learning how to do this now.
Yes.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Jose.
Yep.
So the question that night of the debaters was, if you could give a gift or you could ask for forgiveness, what would you do? And again, this would have been interesting to hear what the audience thought if they were live, but it's very clear all the women on stage asked for forgiveness and all the men gave a gift. And the question is, why is this? Why do we feel the need to apologize for ourselves? So why do women apologize for being themselves? And the real question is, are we made this way or are we taught and trained to believe it? And that's what I'm going to hopefully try to answer tonight. So obviously through the title, our history from antiquity to modern day holds these answers. And I chose these non-traditional female roles to explore the question because we hold deeply ingrained in stereotypes about goddesses, whores, and women positions. And many of them have been misunderstood throughout history. The bottom line is, despite having more women in the workforce than ever before, women's annual median earnings are 20% lower than men's. What is the reason behind this? Discrimination accounts for about 38% of the gender pay gap. 26 of 30 of the highest paying jobs are male-dominated fields, and 23 out of 30 of the lowest paying jobs are female-dominated. And what's interesting is when women move into these male-dominated fields, correcting for all the other things, hours and time off and things like that, women are still paid less, and actually the entire field pays less than it did before women entered whatever field it is. And really what that tells you is once women start doing a job, it's not as valuable and it doesn't seem to take as much skill to accomplish. And that is a classic example of implicit bias. So again, work done by women is not as highly valued as work done by men, but this is a habit of ingrained thoughts and beliefs. This is not a reality. This is not a scientific factual statement. And many people will tell me, well, the pay gap is accounted for by women taking time off to have children or being home with sick children or things along those lines. And actually, even when we account for those, what we call confounding variables that alter an answer to a question, a research question, even when we eliminate those confounders, women still make less than men for performing the same job and doing the same activity. So the ever-present double standard: be seen but not heard, look pretty but not too smart, and be agreeable but not domineering. And women are really supposed to prioritize how we look, our appearances, our facial expressions, and then what people think of us. And what's interesting is when we don't do these things, when we say, oh, I don't really care what people think of me, there's significant social backlash that we face because we're not following along the pathway that's been designated for us. So it goes back to the Hippocratic Oath, which I find interesting. Hippocrates swore by Apollo the physician and by Asclepius, but the gods and now the goddesses were just witnesses. We were marginalized from the beginning. I love this picture because it's so colorful. This is Gaia and Uranus, sort of the earth and the heavens. And they actually, according to Greek mythology, produce the Titans. Uranus hates his children, so he hides them. And Gaia convinces one of her sons, Cronus, to castrate Uranus with a sickle. You're going to see a lot of penile kind of or phallic slides this evening because there's this huge history where if women become too powerful, somehow they can make men's penises disappear. And I find it fascinating that that is the thing that wicked women or witches can do, because I think it's all about fear, basically. And we see that today. So nevertheless, after he castrates his father, he goes on to marry his sister, Rhea. And they produce the first generation of Olympians, which includes Zeus, who becomes the ultimate ruler of the Greek gods. Cronus, however, also doesn't like his children. He swallows them. And then Gaia and Rhea help Zeus overthrow his father. So again, it was a female dominant science or, stories. And then Zeus takes over. He's our alpha male archetype. He fostered a really unsympathetic view of women early on, that they should be beautiful and not trusted. Interestingly enough, Zeus was not chaste. He had fathered over 100 different children, and with many different goddesses or even mortals. And so the rules didn't apply to him. One of his wives was Hera, the queen of Olympus, and she was the goddess of marriage. She was jealous and vengeful toward his lovers. And what's interesting is, despite being the most productive goddess of her generation, she was relegated to the side because she was a mother and she was his wife. Athena is probably the goddess that had the most power or the most freedom. She was the goddess of wisdom. She was a more archetype, more masculine woman. She was born directly of Zeus. She identifies with males, distrusts women. And what's interesting is she's a warrior and a protector. She's got a shield and a helmet. And my son, my oldest son, was walking by the other day when I was working on this talk, and he said, Mom, it's interesting that the Roman version of Athena, which is Minerva, actually, they didn't want her to be a warrior. So they changed what she had dominion over to arts and crafts and cleverness. So again, when women become too powerful, we have to figure out a way to marginalize them. Artemis is another goddess mostly concerned with fertility and health. She devises numerous schemes to avoid marriage. And the keystone to her independence is she's not connected to a male figure. What I find fascinating about this particular statue is this statue was presented by Pope Paul IV to Henry II of France. And what's interesting is there's this subtle but inescapable kind of resemblance to the king's mistress at the time, Diane de Poitiers. So there's always this overlying kind of interacting between goddesses and not having enough power and whores, which is what I'm going to talk about next. And it's always woven through societies as we've gone forward in history. And by the way, I should mention Apollo is Artemis's twin brother, and he's the god. I actually wrote down all the things he's the god of. He gets to be the god of archery, music, dance, truth, prophecy, healing, disease, the sun, and light. And again, both Athena and Artemis are virgins, and that, of course, was highly prized in Greek mythology. Finally, we have Aphrodite, who represents everything that men are afraid of at this time. Physical beauty, sexual love, fertility. She's considered frivolous and deceitful, as all sexually attractive women should be. And what's interesting is Aphrodite was born from the sea, from the castrated genitals of Uranus, emphasizing this connection to fertility. And what's interesting is she is eventually convinced to marry the ugliest immortal. So she commits adultery, and then she becomes sort of the mentor or goddess of whores everywhere. Zeus produced many children, including the Fates and the Muses and the Graces. And I chose the Graces just because this is a beautiful statue, but they represented the goddesses of life's pleasures, beauty, charm, and creativity. And again, these women were envisioned by men and what men wanted women to be. And it's just yet another example. The Hora are also daughters of Zeus. And the reason I bring them up is because they are the goddesses of natural order and the seasons. And they are also, Hora is the Greek root word that for the word horse. So again, there's this idea of whores being part of the natural order. So this is Ishtar. She is identified as the whore of Babylon, the mother of harlots. She's the goddess of sexual activity and fertility. She's kind of immortalized as the first prostitute in the literature, which goes back thousands of years. This is a statue sitting in the Louvre today, dated 2000 BC. She's often depicted in this what we'd call breast offering pose, trying to lure customers. And this is where this became more of a regular activity. So social hierarchies are entrenched in prostitution, as they were in Greek mythology. We still don't get away from that. Initially, prostitutes were actually sacred. It was thought that if they're having intercourse with males, it's part of the natural order. Just like the Hora were the goddesses of natural order and seasons, it's considered very much the same when prostitution kind of comes into being. And Sumerian records date back thousands of years, and they describe high priestesses or prostitutes copulating with kings. What's interesting is Babylon has a well-documented history of prostitution, and the respectable women, when they walked in the streets, they wore head coverings. Believe it or not, next came the slaves, and they wore maybe not as fancy head coverings, but they still were allowed to cover their heads. And they identified prostitutes by not letting them cover their heads. And so they were deemed of a lower status, and were walking the streets without any kind of protection. Again, this social hierarchy, which we'll see repeating itself even today. So as we march forward in time, this idea of women being good or bad, this idea that they need to be mothers and they need to be primarily at home with their children, this concept comes to play more in the 6th century BC. And one of the wise men of Greece, Solon, he actually kind of redevised the government to allow the wealthy to control. And he thought women were a source of friction for men. And so he relegated them either to the home or to the brothels. And so he sort of created this dichotomy where prostitutes were taken care of in the brothels. And this is a picture or a painting of Demosthenes, who was another Greek statesman a little bit later, the 4th century. And his quote is kind of classic to me, that we have courtesans for pleasure, concubines to provide for our daily needs, and our spouses to give us legitimate children, and to be the faithful guardians of our homes. Again, social hierarchy, and this idea that I am the man and I'm going to relegate women into their places in their certain boxes. This is one of my favorite slides. As I was studying prostitution, that alone is kind of an interesting thing to say. I actually got all of my books from the Kitsap Regional Library, and many of them had been either stolen and needed to go on order from other libraries. So it must be kind of a popular subject, but I was not aware of the hierarchies deeply entrenched in prostitution. And I won't read you this entire list, but we have prostitutes that only sleep with politicians from well-off families. We have charming foreign-born women who are very expensive. We have the lupe, which are she-wolves, and they howl in the evening to attract customers. We have nighttime streetwalkers, and one of my favorites are the bustuariae, which hang around at burial grounds and were called grave watchers. And what's interesting is apparently a lot of sex was going on during this time in graveyards, and then they would carve their names in the tombstones, or they would carve curses on dead family members or spouses or people they've been in relationships with to cast eternal damnation on them. So I do find this whole idea of that one kind of prostitute is better or worse than another kind of prostitute. And this idea during this time was this: how do we resolve this conundrum that males have a need to be promiscuous and have lots of different women, and women are supposed to be chaste? Well, that dichotomy was resolved through prostitution, and they relegated these prostitutes to a lower standing in society. And by prizing chastity and female virginity, it was easier to ostracize this certain group of women. So the Lupanar is a large brothel found in Pompeii, and it attests to the practice of prostitution in Rome. To be honest with you, it's actually one of my favorite buildings that I've ever seen. I've been there a number of times because every time I go back to Europe, I try to actually go see the brothel in Pompeii. And it is so well preserved. It's actually breathtaking. It's the bottom floor is the only thing that's preserved. There were reportedly 2 floors with 5 rooms each. And above each of the rooms is a picture like this, also known as a fresco. And there are women and men in different positions. And they didn't miss very many, I will tell you that. And what's interesting is the thought was that the men would pay to have sex. They'd go in, they'd point at a certain fresco and say, that's what I want to do. And in each of these rooms, if you haven't been there, there's a stone slab, almost like a bed, kind of, and there's a stone pillow, which is interesting. And obviously, they were very clear about what they wanted to do. They would do it, and then they would leave. And what I find fascinating is this hasn't changed. I mean, I understand we don't have large brothels built this way with frescoes hanging above. But again, there's still this idea that these women are relegated to a certain portion of society. This is just another fresco. I chose 2 that I thought were fairly clean, depending on who was watching tonight. And one of the more interesting things about Pompeii, in one of the basilicas, there's an inscription on the wall that says, if anyone is looking for some tender love in this town, keep in mind here, all the girls are very friendly. These are Spintria, which were the Roman tokens found at Pompeii. And we've kind of assumed over the years that they were used to pay prostitutes for varied services. And you can see there's the same idea that it's a very business-like activity. You know, we've got different positions on each of the coins. There's a flip side with Roman numerals. And it's the same idea that you would either hand them the token or point to your fresco, and you would do your business. So as we march forward in time, Constantine comes into power and religion comes into play. One of my favorite quotes is from William Blake that says, "Prisons are built with stones of law, brothels with bricks of religion." And what's interesting about this whole thing is that the idea that prostitution is immoral really takes hold as religion rises into prominence as we go into the 320 AD and beyond. And what's also interesting is Constantine's mother, Helena, was probably a consort of his father. So nevertheless, he believed prostitution threatened civil tranquility and morality. So he destroys Ishtar's temples and he abolishes sacred prostitution. And it ends up kind of falling out of favor all over the world. He built Christian churches instead. And what's even more fascinating to me is there are still many biblical scholars or religious scholars who are not convinced that Constantine converted to Christianity even on his deathbed. So religion is interesting because it was another way to give dominion. And I'm not saying that's true today, but at this time, it was another way to give men dominion and control over what was going on around them. So no discussion would be complete on prostitution without the dichotomy of women and Christianity. Whether or not you're a Christian, I think it's really important to kind of understand the roles of some of the women in the Bible, just because it's an interesting anthropological history. So obviously, I would argue the two most important women in the Bible would be Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ, who was a virgin, and then Mary Magdalene. Now, Mary Magdalene is interesting because gospel writers portrayed prostitutes as poor and exploited. Her story has this emphasis on the challenges of a woman making her way in the world without a man. She's clearly significant in the Bible because she discovers the empty grave of Jesus Christ. She's the first to witness the resurrection. And what I find fascinating is the Greek root word for Magdalene actually means hairdresser. So we talk about her being a prostitute, and she's kind of identified as that. She's this prostitute that converted, and she's the kind of textbook inspiration for people who convert to Christianity. But it's still a matter of debate whether she was a prostitute or a hairdresser or what she did. And again, there's this idea that if you follow this path, you can get to the promised land or to acceptance or to forgiveness. And I think it's a really important historical point. I won't concentrate too much on the Bible other than to talk about one of my favorite stories, which is about Bathsheba. And I did attend a Christian school, for those of you that don't know, growing up. I attended Bremerton Christian, which is now Cross Point. And I remember learning about Bathsheba. And of course, these details weren't necessarily shared in elementary school like I'm going to share them tonight. But she's bathing on a rooftop, and David sees her, King David sees her and thinks she's beautiful. And I put the quote up here. So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. She becomes pregnant in the story, and her husband Uriah is on the front line fighting for the kingdom. And David, not wanting to get discovered, tries to encourage Uriah to come home, sleep with his wife, so that there would be no doubts that it was his baby. And Uriah is so devoted to the kingdom that he won't leave the front line. So David stations him on the front line where he's killed. After a period of mourning, David marries Bathsheba. And if you want to go back and read it, please do so. It's fascinating. But what's interesting is Bathsheba, we're talking about her through this whole story, but really the story is, what does David do and what does Uriah respond? And it's almost like she's a tennis ball being battered back and forth. We don't even know if she consented to have intercourse with David. And many biblical scholars believe that she did not. She was in fact raped. And I'm not suggesting we need to talk about this in young ages of school children, but there's always been this perception that she seduced him. And when I look back on it now as an adult, I don't necessarily think that's true. Many households didn't have indoor plumbing in that time. So many women bathed on their rooftops. So it's not as if she was bathing on a rooftop as an unusual activity to attract attention. And I think that's really probably the most important part of this, is that we need to start looking at these stories a little bit differently. So we head to the Middle Ages with the fall of Rome and discovery of the New World. The Catholic Church takes over. And what's interesting is the church believed that prostitutes were doing society a favor, because if they were sleeping with prostitutes, then good, wholesome, moral women probably wouldn't be raped or attacked. And St. Thomas Aquinas said something about prostitution being like a sewer in a palace. If the sewer was removed, the palace would be filled with pollution. And so we sort of were supposed to accept prostitution. However, as religious power grew and women began helping their fellow women with childbirth and using medications to help stop bleeding in childbirth, they got accused of witchcraft. And so that became the new way to hold women and relegate them to kind of the back corners. Witch hunting spread quickly throughout Europe. And this is a picture of St. Joan of Arc. She was a French patriot and martyr. She was actually tried for heresy and sorcery, and she was burned at the stake and in France. And I actually wrote down what her accusations were, so I'm going to read those to you. This woman, utterly disregarding what is honorable in the female sex, breaking the bounds of modesty and forgetting all female decency, has disgracefully put on the clothing of the male sex, a striking monstrosity. So really, there were other things, of course, she was tried for, but a good deal of it was the fact she dressed like a man. And her answer was, it is more seemly and proper to dress like this when surrounded by men than wearing a woman's clothes. While I have been in prison, the English have molested me when I was dressed as a woman. I have done this to defend my modesty. Yet she was burned at the stake. Around this same time, this very interesting document came out called The Hammer of Witches, or the I always have trouble, Maleficarum. And it's an interesting book. I haven't read it necessarily, but it's interesting what it did to society at that time. It was written by a Catholic clergyman, and in a nutshell, it endorsed extermination of witches for the purpose of using basically civilian laws to do it, saying you broke this law and now you need to be burned at the stake. And it raises this idea that it's criminal to practice witchcraft, which isn't well defined. And what's interesting is this book had strong influence on European culture for a number of centuries. And a quote from the book is really, no one does more harm to the Catholic Church than midwives. And the reason they were against midwives is midwives would use ergot medications, which would stop cramping, and they would stop actually women from bleeding to death. And that was viewed as women basically taking back control of their lives. And we wouldn't want women to have control of their lives, because then what might happen? Moving forward, we move to the time of venereal disease. This is a beautiful painting, I thought, by Fabio Fabi, which is a typical harem in the Ottoman Empire. And so there's a large outbreak of syphilis in Naples towards the turn of the 15th century, basically. And just to let you know, venereal, the word venereal is derived from the pursuit of Venus, the goddess of love. And so again, we still have this kind of crossover with goddesses and prostitutes. Syphilis was called the Great Pox and or the French disease. Yet the Ottomans called it the Portuguese disease. The Portuguese called it the Chinese disease. Everybody had a name for this disease. And this is when attitudes kind of began to harden against prostitution, because they viewed prostitutes as sort of spreading venereal disease throughout Europe. And the brothels were causing this worsened disease spread. As we move forward into the Victorian age, syphilis, what's interesting about syphilis is it's a disease. For those, and I'm sure all of us realize by now, syphilis affects both men and women. Yet again, we see in history, men and what they did through law and through police enforcement inflicted pain and damage on women, and actually children as well. So syphilis, what they did to control syphilis is many countries of the world started passing contagious disease acts. And what these disease acts contained is basically it allowed for policemen to scour the streets for prostitutes and identify who they are. And any poor woman who was identified as a prostitute was ordered to submit to a medical examination or be imprisoned. This went on in the United States. This went on all over Europe. It went on through Eastern Europe as well. And there was almost nothing you could do. And Once you were identified as a prostitute, you couldn't get off the roster. Policemen were known to blackmail women. They would actually target illiterate women who couldn't read or write and get them to sign their names on these registers. And even minor children were coerced into doing this and ending up on the registers. And what's fascinating, or even more horrifying, is a lot of these examinations were done by untrained professionals, and women were infected or they died related to these examinations they were forced to submit. So again, now we move to more violence. Not only are we relegating women to this hierarchy, we want to control what they're doing, but now that infection is running rampant, we wouldn't want men to change anything. We just want to relegate women that we think are bad women who are spreading it, and will inflict permanent damage on them. And there was little that people could do at this time to prevent it. So I love to talk about the American dream, and I love that there's kind of these edges that are burned. And the reason I say that is America was started as it's a representative republic. And what's interesting is at the beginning, and still there's this thread running through society, women are the property of husbands, brothers, fathers, a white male owner. And that is really still the background founding of this country. It's also built on a hierarchy of life. So men versus women, able-bodied versus disabled, white versus people of color, and good women or respectable women and prostitutes. I love the history that I recently found out about Thomas Jefferson. I find it kind of fascinating. Early settlers came without women. So a lot of different purveyors would send women to the Virginia area so that they could basically meet the needs of these males who needed to have sex. And Benjamin Franklin wrote a book called Advice to the Young Man on the Choice of a Mistress. And in it, he suggests that older women would be better as mistresses because they can't get pregnant and they're more experienced. And then he ends his book with saying, all mares look the same in the dark. So this hierarchy persists. I added one famous prostitute, Julia Boulette, a prostitute who managed to achieve respectable status. And this was in the Old West. And the way she achieved respectable status is she nursed many firemen, policemen, and men in Virginia City, Nevada, during an influenza outbreak. She took care of them. She turned her brothel into a makeshift hospital. And that is how she achieved respectable status. So as we're moving forward to some of how women have entered healthcare, tolerating behavior in males that is not tolerated in females entrenches social hypocrisy. And this same double standard that frowns on female promiscuity grimaces at the idea of an assertive woman in the workplace. And to me, that's where a lot of this hierarchy and gender bias kind of comes from. So, love this picture. We can do it. How do we dismantle these hierarchies? And I think it can be done because our generation of children do not yet have this built-in hierarchy that we seem to have internalized without even realizing it. And so the other piece we need to remember is a hierarchy is a habit, just like gender bias is a habit. Habits can be broken. To be honest with you, I think it's almost easier to change habits than it is to change attitudes of people who feel women are not equal to men. So the rod of Asclepius, who is the ancient god of medicine, it's one snake wrapped around a staff, as you see here. And medicine even is entrenched in male symbolism. The U.S. Army Medical Corps actually accidentally adopted the caduceus, which probably looks a little more familiar to you all as being a medical symbol. It's actually a mistake. The caduceus is depicted by two snakes and a pair of wings, and it's the staff of the Greek god Hermes, who is the god of the marketplace, the patron of commerce and the fat purse, and he is the special protector of the traveling salesman, which really doesn't fit medicine at all. So the caduceus mistake actually even emphasizes male attributes. Many figures carried the caduceus, not just Hermes. Priapus, who is a minor fertility god, a protector of livestock gardens, and don't forget the all-important male genitalia, he carries a caduceus wand. Like Mercury, he wears winged sandals and holds a caduceus. This is a fresco in one of my favorite places, Pompeii. And when you zoom out, you see it's all about his male genitalia. He was known actually for his permanently erect penis, and we still use that term today when that happens to men, and it's called priapism. And so again, we've got this man carrying this fertility god, carrying this caduceus, and somehow this mistake is now our symbol of medicine. So what does a physician look like? I think if you'd asked me as a child, I probably would have told you it was a man. Many more men obviously were in the healthcare field than women, and women were nurses. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's nice that we have a little bit more balance today. This is another cover of the New Yorker that I think is stunning. And then there's some fellow physicians who, of all colors and backgrounds, who kind of recreated the picture. And I love this idea that physicians and surgeons can look like anyone. So I'm going to read this quote, which is one of my favorites. Women have always been healers. For centuries, women were doctors without degrees, barred from books and lectures, learning from each other and passing on experience from neighbor to neighbor and mother to daughter. They were called wise women by people, witches or charlatans, by the authorities. Medicine is part of our heritage as women, our history and our birthright. And that comes from a book titled Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, A History of Women Healers. Barbara Ehrenreich wrote that book. And it's actually where I got the idea for the name of this talk. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge medicine is a part of our birthright. It's part of our heritage, and we need to continue pushing the envelope. So I'm going to talk about a couple of really important female figures in history that I think deserve our attention and deserve our reverence. Dorothea Bergslaben was the first woman MD in Germany. Her father, who was a doctor, supported her getting an education, and he petitioned Frederick the Great to allow her to attend classes. He was enlightened, and so he granted that request, but they would not let her take the exams or graduate. And what's interesting is she went on to marry a man with 5 children, and she bore 4 of her own. So she raised 9 children, and she took care of the poor, vulnerable, and women as a physician, despite not being able to have a license. Somewhere along the way, she lost a patient, an elderly patient, and her detractors or opponents went after her in court for practicing witchcraft. See, it's still going on even hundreds of years later. So for practicing witchcraft and then practicing medicine without a license. And what's interesting is in her defense, she challenged the court to allow her to take the medical exams and said, hey, look, if I can't pass, maybe then we can talk about this. But if I pass, you're going to have to grant me a medical license. And so she was allowed to sit after a year of bantering back and forth. She was allowed to sit for those exams. She passed with flying colors, and she was awarded a degree in 1754. The University of Halle that she graduated from didn't graduate another female physician for almost 150 years till 1901. And actually, after she did pass her exams and became a full-fledged doctor, she still worked with marginalized populations until her death in 1772. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson was the first woman MD in England in 1865. She was rejected by many medical schools. She studied to be a nurse while working to be admitted. She found a loophole, as many women in medicine early on did. She discovered the Society of the Apothecaries had no rules against women doctors. So she took and passed the exams, which allowed her to become a doctor. And of course, she'd been to classes with the medical students. So she had a reasonable amount of information, of course. But right after this, the society officially banned women from taking the exams. And what's interesting is the British Medical Association, she joined them in 1873 because they also didn't have rules against women physicians being part of their organization. After she was admitted, of course, they immediately ran out and stopped any other women from becoming part of the British Medical Association. And she actually later served as the organization's president and continued again, interestingly enough, to work with marginalized populations until her death. I should make special mention of Dr. James Berry. And Dr. James Berry was born Margaret Ann Bulkley. And he predated Dr. Anderson's degree in England and got his medical degree. And the reason I'm stumbling a little bit is he is actually the first transgender physician. And since he preferred to be identified as a male, I'm going to honor that. And just let you know that history, I think, is really important. So he's the first transgender physician, and I would call Dr. Anderson the first female physician in England Maria Montessori, no discussion would be complete without her contributions to the world. She's the first Italian woman to earn a medical degree, and she defied convention in a very conservative country. Pope Leo XIII actually intervened to enroll her in the University of Rome's medical program. And she graduated in 1896. And like her predecessors, female physicians, she worked with the poor and vulnerable, particularly with an interest in children. And obviously, her work at the Children's Hospital led to her creation or development of an educational theory. And for those of you who've attended Montessori schools, which I did and all my children have as well, have benefited from her work in teaching children how to be independent in their education. So let's talk about important women physicians in the US, and there's a number of these. This is kind of an interesting, one of my favorite subjects. The strongest, most dedicated women who managed to acquire their degrees deserve to be remembered for their fortitude. And these early pioneers opened the doors for many women, including myself, who followed in their footsteps. We start off, of course, with Elizabeth Blackwell. She was the first woman in America to receive a medical degree. She studied with doctors, yet her applications to medical school were all rejected. Then Geneva Medical College accidentally accepted her in 1847. And in a nutshell, the faculty there put her admittance to a vote. And as a joke, the male medical students voted yes to admit her. So she kind of got in by chance. And what's interesting is, in particular, she wanted to be a surgeon. However, she got a disease from a patient, an infection that damaged her eyesight. So she ended up working essentially as a general physician, serving, again, mostly marginalized populations. What's neat about her is actually a friend of mine, Hala Sabri, who may be watching tonight. She has fought to have a National Women's Physicians Day, which is February 3rd. Annually, we celebrate that, and that is Elizabeth Blackwell's birthday. And every year I pick a female physician to write about and to focus on. So some of you may have seen some of these that I'll talk about tonight. So Anne Preston should probably be regarded as one of the earliest academic female physicians. After working as an apprentice for a physician, she was rejected by 4 medical schools in Philadelphia, as were all women. And then finally in 1850, she enrolled in the first class at the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania, graduating 18 months later, and she served as a professor at the school. When the first women arrived, however, at her school, once she was on the faculty, she fought to get them to work alongside the medical students. And when they entered the school, they were throwing rocks, tobacco, and other things at the women. And on the way out, the women were actually pelted with rocks once they were leaving the hospital after completing their work for the day, observing other physicians caring for patients. And that's kind of surprising that that was even going on then. One of my personal favorites is Dr. Mary Edwards Walker. After graduating from medical school in 1855, Walker volunteered for the Union Army. She was not allowed to enlist, of course. Then she treated wounded soldiers at the First Battle of Bull Run, and a field surgeon there noticed her skills and brought her on officially as part of the Army. Walker was taken as a POW in 1864 by the Confederacy and held for a number of months. She was termed the Lady Doctor Spy down there in the South, and she ended up being actually permanently disabled after her time spent in a Confederate prison. What's interesting is in 1865, at the behest of President Lincoln, Walker was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He actually signed the order before he was assassinated, so that order stood even after he died. And she was given that Medal of Honor for her efforts at the First Battle of Bull Run. And she is still the only woman in this nation who have ever received this honor. Ironically, in the 1900s, the War Commission voted to rescind some of the medals that had been given out previously, including hers. And my favorite part of the story is when those Army representatives showed up at her house, she met them at the front door with a shotgun and told them they were not taking her medal. And she held on to her medal even after she died, even up to the time she died. And it is now in the Women's Museum in New York. And you know, what's interesting about her, of course, she's a fascinating historical figure. If you go back and read, she was involved with women's suffrage. She ran for office before women had the right to vote. She actually died 2 years before 1919, where we got the right to vote. And what's interesting is many reports are more about the fact that she dressed like a man, she looked like a lesbian, and she did not behave, quote, like she should. And what I find so fascinating is we have this woman who was actually renowned on the battlefield for preventing unnecessary amputations. And she did amazing things for soldiers on the battlefield. And yet we're worried about what her sexual orientation was and how she dressed. This next woman is Rebecca Lee Crumpler, and she's the first Black woman ever to earn an MD in the United States. In 1864, she graduated from the New England Female Medical College and married Arthur Crumpler. After the Civil War, she served the medical needs of freed slaves, working for the Freedmen's Bureau in Richmond, Virginia. The reason there's no picture is no picture exists of Rebecca Crumpler. This is a book she wrote, and so I wanted some aspect of her to be seen by everyone tonight. And there's another piece of interesting trivia that until recently, she was buried in an unmarked grave. And what's really interesting to me is the Hyde Park Library is a nonprofit, and they put out a request to fund gravestones for both her and her husband. And when I saw that, I don't think I've ever grabbed my credit card quite as fast as I ever have previously when I'm donating to something, because I figured they only needed about $5,000. And at the time I figured, oh, this is going to go fast. And it turns out, so of course I donated immediately, and I got in there, and I just recently received a letter. There were 120 of us who donated. We come from 21 states. And now Dr. Crumpler, who in my mind has a very important and critically valuable place in history, has headstone. Both her and her husband have headstone that was in place, and there was a ceremony for that in August 2020. So I personally feel very proud to have actually been part of something like that. And I think women physicians, there are many that I won't be covering tonight, but I think the more we stand together, the more progress we'll make. So somewhere about the mid to late 1800s, we had this lovely man, Dr. Clark. Now, he's well known for deciding that women can either menstruate or educate, but they cannot do both. And he published a book, Sex and Education, quote, A Fair Chance for Girls. And by a fair chance, he meant that he knew females who graduated from school or college as excellent scholars, but with undeveloped ovaries. So later they married and were sterile. His rationale was that it was dangerous for women to menstruate and think at the same time. Can you imagine? So Mary Putnam Jacobi actually fought him directly. She graduated from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, where Ann Preston was now part of the faculty at 22 years of age. And she used empirical data to refute Clark's views and presented her findings without emotion or personal opinion. And one of her quotes from her articles or her research was, "There's nothing in the nature of menstruation to imply the necessity or even the desirability of rest." So my final personal or professional mentor tonight is extremely important to me. Susan LaFleche Picotti. She is the first, not only Indigenous female physician in the US, she's likely the first Indigenous physician. And I will tell you, she's my personal hero. There's a wonderful book that has been written about her. It's called A Warrior for the People: How Susan LaFleche Overcame Racial and Gender Inequality to Become America's First Indian Doctor, by Joe Starita. And if you have any interest at all, please read it. It's absolutely wonderful, kind of a life-changing book for me. Susan was a valedictorian, graduating in her class after 3 years of study. She was a quintessential family doctor. She served in limitless capacity in the Dakotas for the Omaha people. She saw both Indigenous people as well as white settlers. She focused on public health. She fought for temperance. She fought for Omaha land rights. She wrote for her local newspaper and never gave up the fight for social justice. And what's interesting is she decided to become a physician at a young age. And I think that's where I kind of have a connection with her. I was 5, she was a little older. But she held a woman's hand who died in agony. And the physician was summoned more than 4 times and he never came. And she said that experience taught her that, quote, it was only an Indian, so that person's life didn't matter according to conventional medicine, and she was going to change that. And she made house calls in a buggy, in like a horse-drawn. Well, actually, I think she was covered in buffalo, but she was in a horse-drawn buggy wrapped in a buffalo robe, and she even took her children when they were nursing with her in the middle of the winter to visit families. She would come home from 20-hour workdays, and there would be a line of patients outside her door. And she always kept her lantern lit at night in case someone needed her. What's really interesting about her is actually there's a Susan Picotti LaFleche Hospital in Walt Hill, Nebraska. And it was completed in 1913, and it's the very first privately funded hospital built on a reservation in the United States. And right now it's in disrepair, and a large fundraising effort is underway. Every year on Indigenous Peoples Day for the last 2 years, now it will be 3 years because that just passed on Monday, I send off a donation to the fund. And now it's a lot easier. I used to have to mail it in that first year. And now I put this website down here if anyone has any interest. They've just been given a $600,000 grant. And so most of the individuals who are donating, it's going to go to making it more homey or more comfortable for those who will tour or will be involved with bringing it back to its standard of what it was originally. So as a woman, she's just a tremendous trailblazer, and I wish I'd known her. So let's talk about today, drivers of discrimination against women physicians. There's kind of 3 categories that I have: broad cultural norms, culture of medicine, and maternal discrimination. And there's still this implicit bias that women who are pretty and women should be pretty, well-behaved, and nurturing. So we bring up one of my favorite childhood TV shows, and I often say, why do these real life images of female surgeons in scrubs or camouflage-clad soldiers make us so uncomfortable, more uncomfortable than these highly sexualized images of women? And I think it's because we didn't question it. We thought Wonder Woman's supposed to look like this, and what she's wearing is something called boob armor. There's actually a name for it, and it's a form-fitting breastplate complete with bra cups designed for sexuality rather than fighting. Title IX passed in 1972, and what Title IX said is no person in the United States shall, based on sex, be excluded from participation or be denied benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Despite that, 50 years, despite the fact that was 50 years ago, women remain underrepresented in professional leadership positions. And what I find fascinating is, despite the fact that in 1995, which is the year I entered medical school, we had an equal number of female and male physicians in my entering class. Despite that, only 34% of associate professors are women, and only 16% of the deans of the medical schools are women. The glass ceiling, most of you are familiar with the glass ceiling. It's this invisible systemic barrier preventing women from rising in leadership. But what we should be talking about is something known as the broken rung. It's our biggest obstacle. We get stuck at the entry level and we're not promoted to management. This is not a pipeline problem. I want to be very clear. This is not about women not being capable or women staying home to raise children and not being present to climb up the ladder. This is about women getting told no. They are far less likely to be promoted, even once we remove those confounders, such as childbearing, staying home with our children, etc. And it's even worse for women of color and other sexual orientations or non-traditional situations. So let's talk about academic institutions. It's present everywhere. This was a fascinating study done in the field of internal medicine. A grand rounds is kind of what I'm doing now. If you were all sitting here in this auditorium, we're all physicians, I would be presenting on a subject. And so what's interesting is when females introduce male speakers, professional titles such as Dr. Smith were used 95% of the time. When males introduce female speakers, professional titles are used only 49%, not even half the time. So Helen, Susie, etc. And what's interesting is this may amplify a marginalization and undermine the self-confidence of women faculty and academics, because professional titles often influence perceived expertise. So this quote is borrowed from a study done as part of Physicians' Moms Group that was published in the British Medical Journal. There was a second study also, I've referenced both of them at the end of this presentation, in JAMA, so our Journal of the American Medical Association. And these are direct quotes from physicians who were anonymously turned them in for evaluation. And this female physician was told by nursing administration she should smile more. Now, we're all familiar with the debate last week. And here's the thing, I cannot believe this was so easy to find. Here is a conglomeration of Kamala Harris's facial expressions, as if that means she's angry, not appropriate, whatever. is said, I don't care about her facial expressions. Whether you like her or not is not part of really what I'm trying to concentrate on tonight. What I'm trying to talk about is, why did we not do this with Mike Pence? I see lots of flies on his head. I've seen lots of pictures of that, but I really haven't had anybody commenting about his facial expressions. And I think that's part of the problem. Society holds these preconceived notions about how women should behave. And there's something called stereotype susceptibility. It's a phenomenon where an implicit belief alters performance in the same direction predicted by that stereotype. So if we're going to administer a test in elementary school, and right before the test, the teacher gets up and says, girls aren't good at math. Girls will score lower on that test than if someone gets up and either doesn't say anything or says, girls do well in math. And we are susceptible to not believing in ourselves. I believe it's probably true of boys as well, but I don't know that they get as many messages like this. And the reason I bring this up is one of my favorite personal stories is Mr. Dormeyer, who has passed away. He was a principal of mine in elementary school. And I got into a fight. I was 7 in the 4th grade, and a 9-year-old boy took the handball. I grabbed it, ran into the gym, fell over a mat and rolled over. He tackled me. I shoved the ball in his face. Apparently I gave him a bloody nose. So in a nutshell, I ended up in the principal's office at that afternoon. And I remember, this is 1984, so to his credit, we didn't have all of this discussion about gender bias. And I very clearly remember him saying, you are a young lady. I need you to behave like a young lady. And what's funny is, as the conversation came to an end, he said, okay, now that we're done with that, where do you want to go for pizza tomorrow? And they had a rule at the time at Bremerton Christian School that if you got a 4.0, that the principal would take you out for pizza. And so apparently I was the only student. I very clearly remember him saying, you're the only one, so where are we going tomorrow for pizza? And I remember leaving that conversation thinking, well, maybe it's not so bad that I don't act like a girl, because at least I'm smart. And I'm not suggesting that that's the perfect lesson for a 4th grader to get. But, you know, I think if we had more girls in elementary school getting the message that they are capable and they can do great things, even when they act like a boy, I think it would go a long way with helping with this susceptibility. And to be honest with you, I think this slide is the crux of my talk to a certain extent, because I think this is where we learn to apologize for who we are. We learn we're supposed to act a certain way, people are supposed to like us, and that's what probably needs to change. So another really important figure, and I know Lynn brought up the fact that RBG is no longer with us. What's interesting is there's this concept of only women, and they tend to have it really hard. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg recalled in her years as the solitary female justice after Sandra Day O'Connor retired were actually the worst times. And her quote captures beautifully what I've been trying to talk to you about tonight, which is the image to the public entering, sorry, I'm getting a signal about time, my apologies. So I'm good though. So the image to the public entering the courtroom was 8 men of a certain size and this little woman sitting to the side. That was not a good image for the public to see. And to me, that crystallizes what's so important about what we need to do and the work we still have cut out for us. Eventually, RBG was joined by 2 fabulous women, both named by President Obama, Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan. And I know there's another woman up as well for the position. Just to give you some statistics, only women in the workplace affects about 1 in 5 women. They're twice as likely to be asked to prove their competence, 3 times as likely to experience gender or sexual discrimination, and twice as likely to experience demeaning remarks. So there's this culture of medicine, right? Medicine's considered a lonely profession. Female physicians are often called bossy or difficult to work with. 80% of professional women experience harassment. 70% of medical students experience gender discrimination during medical school. I think gender bias persists in medicine because, again, it's an unconscious belief about women. And again, what's interesting is female physicians are 46% more likely to die by suicide than women in general. And I think that's a really important part of this talk. These are just 2 examples of quotes I found horrifying from that same paper in the British Medical Journal. Administrators told one female physician, you should just stay at home and be a mom. I mean, your husband makes enough money. Why do you bother working? And then another example is a woman who my first chair gave the man who I supervised the title of Director of Clinical Services. My boss explained I would still do the job, but the title had to go to him so that we could give him a raise. because his wife had just had her second baby and wanted to stay home. And that was the lifestyle my boss wanted to promote. I'm sure you've seen many slides like this. The adjectives used to describe women, prudish, nagging, high-strung, frivolous, flirtatious versus self-confident, realistic, masculine. I mean, these are built into our language, and that's what we need to work on. I'm sorry if I've offended anyone with this slide, but this is what a physician who's still working in this community called me. That's why I didn't name him. I named some others. But in 2003, a local ER doctor consulted me regarding a patient. And I'm no different than any other female physician. Every female physician could probably tell you 20 different stories like this. Anyway, he called me asking for advice. I recommended a simple lab test. And then he asked me why I'm always such a bitch. I hung up on him. And I still kind of grimaced like, oh, I should have hung up on him. But nevertheless, a week later, I ended up in Dr. Belding's office. This is a physician who's retired. This is no insult to him. He was the chief medical officer at the time. I did show up in his office a number of times. He suggested, quote, I needed to behave myself if I wanted to be well-liked. And again, this is 2003. We weren't talking about this stuff. And anyway, that was what his information to me was. And I asked at the time, well, I'd appreciate it if no more physicians called me these derogatory names. And he kind of shrugged and said, he's not sure this physician would change. Now, this physician has changed. I have spoken to him a number of times since. He's never called me a name. But what's interesting is I wish at the time I hadn't just nodded my head and said, okay. I should have said something like, well-behaved women rarely make history, or, okay, well, if any other physicians call me names, I'm just going to continue to hang up on them. And I think that's the way we push back. We simply say, no, that's not acceptable to call me those names. So another example of a study, which is a direct evaluations by ER faculty. And what this study is in a nutshell saying is women receive criticism for their personality and men not as often. So 62% of women were critiqued on their personality traits, whereas only 36% of male residents were. Out of a group of residents, only one female received no negative comments, and 50% of the males received no negative comments. And on top of that, actually, the feedback's really inconsistent. So Emma is a hypothetical person in the study, and she is told she's receptive to feedback. She can improve by being more open to feedback, meaning she's now not receptive. Then another said she needs to be more assertive because she's not assertive enough. And then one says Emma argues a lot. I mean, it's really hard with this kind of inconsistent feedback to understand how to improve. So microaggressions, let's talk about microaggressions. For those who are not familiar, it's a form of everyday discrimination grounded in bias. And whether it's intentional or not, microaggressions are often directed at those with less power. Women of color or disabilities are often more likely to face these demeaning remarks. And these negative experiences add up over time. So women experiencing microaggressions in the workplace are 3 times more likely to think about leaving their job. So a great example I have is what I call the princess. And when I first came to town here, obstetricians would consult pediatricians for when they needed help. And many OBs had like the ward clerk call and just say, hey, you're needed. And I would often say, well, wait a second, why? Well, I don't know, just come into the hospital. And I always felt like walking into a potential bad case really wasn't the best for the patient. It wasn't the best for the physician, and it probably contributed to complications over the years. So I kept asking, why am I not getting called by someone in the room? It doesn't have to be the doctor, but a clinician of some sort, a nurse, an assistant, someone who's involved in clinical care can call me and tell me why a pediatrician is needed to attend this delivery. So actually I took a stand after asking and not getting anywhere. I stopped accepting consult requests. I just said, I'm not going to leave my house until somebody calls me and tells me. And Dr. Zarnecki, who's now retired, he began calling me the princess. And I think he didn't like that I took a stand. This was in the early 2000s. And he would answer the phone and call me the princess. He'd say, okay, princess, I'm going to call you now. And I'm sure that was discussed amongst many obstetricians, whether or not others called me the princess. I'll never know. But it's just another example of a microaggression, a way of sort of saying, you're getting out of hand. You need to settle down and do what I'm telling you to do. So maternal discrimination, and this is kind of unique. There's been this insidious, persistent, more blatant discrimination that women experience as a mother, as well as a female physician. And the implicit beliefs can vary from doctors cannot be good mothers, women physicians should delay childbearing, physician mothers don't value their career, and childbearing ruins their career. I'm just going to use two examples. The first is, as a third-year medical student, a male attending told one mom, I had to decide if I was going to be a good mother or a good doctor, but I couldn't be both. We don't hear men being told they can't be a good doctor and a good father. And another kind of horrifying example is a surgical resident who had a miscarriage. In the OR, she was bleeding through her clothes, and a senior resident wouldn't find someone to relieve her. And the interesting thing is, what people don't understand is, a lot of you that maybe didn't go through residency would say, well, just go. Well, what you don't understand is that supervising resident holds the keys to you getting a good job, networking, and being accepted by the community. And it's a really hard place to be. So again, the outcomes of maternal discrimination are limited advancement opportunities, financial inequalities, and then lack of support in pregnancy and breastfeeding during the postpartum period. And often women physicians report being punished for needing to take a pump break. A lot of male coworkers will call maternity leave a vacation or, well, time off. And what's interesting is 40% of female physicians are working part-time within 6 years of completing residency training, in large part because they're mothers to young children. So in closing, I'm going to say solving old problems requires new strategies. We need to acknowledge implicit gender bias. It's a habit, and habits can be changed. Women in positions of power must call attention to gender-based inequity. And I think standing here all these years later, I've been in this community actually for nearly 20 years. I write for the newspaper, so most people know whether they like me or not, I'm honest and I kind of lead with my heart. And part of it is, when we see this happening in the community, we need to call it. It's not okay. And we need to change the narrative about women who do their job. We need to start evaluating their competence and not how their hair looks, their appearance, their facial expressions, their clothing, or their makeup. Our goals should be, look, we're all women, or many of us are women, and I'd love for the men to join us too in this. Many of us are mothers. We all have a responsibility as women and as parents to change this whole belief system for the next generation. We need to make sure our sons accept women as equal in all things, workplace, marriage, and parenting. We need to make sure our daughters accept themselves for who they are and understand what great things they're capable of, and that they don't need to apologize for standing up for themselves or knowing the right answer in elementary school. We need to be careful not to judge women by the male standard. We'd be using the wrong standard. Own your piece of the challenge with your voice, with your vote, and with your actions, and be who you are. No matter what, you have to lead with who you are. When we're hiding ourselves, it does no one any good. And go ahead and make the change you wish to see in the world from where you're standing. And before you think our job is done, this is an advertisement that set all women physicians practically our hair on fire. And it came out 1 week ago. It's from a scrub company. Figs. This is what sexism in medicine looks like. This is still what sexism in medicine looks like. Women physicians and nurses, clinicians, frankly, whores and goddesses actually deserve respect. And this is a picture of a female DO physician. DOs are like MDs. They're trained the same way. They have more training in manipulation and a few other aspects of medicine, but they pass the same exams. They're the equivalent of an MD. And the bottom line is, this is a model who's wearing pink scrubs. She's got a DO on her on the badge on her waist, and she's reading medical terminology for dummies upside down. And I didn't put the slide of the man in here tonight, but he's in maroon scrubs, sitting in a relaxed kind of position with a stethoscope around his neck. Totally different message they're sending to the world. Now, another physician put up this picture, and the picture's from Dr. Grace Hugh, and I had her permission to use it. She actually took an 11-blade scalpel and she took off all the tags of her scrubs because she doesn't want to advertise for figs any longer. And so I love this picture because fighting sexism is about making deep cuts in all sorts of things. And this is such a great picture, I had to share it. Finally, my second to last slide is, I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. And I would encourage all of you listening to look inside it and see where you can make changes, or your next door neighbor, the girl down the street, whoever it is that is not feeling like they're equal, or someone's treating them that way. Intervene when you can. And really, if you can change your habits, we can change the world. So my last picture is, first of all, there's my email for additional comments if you don't feel comfortable commenting tonight, niranalagba@gmail.com. I wanted that Gmail thing to be together, but it didn't work out. And then this is a rival scrubs company this week who put out this beautiful ad of Dr. Alyssa Cole, who is a DO physician, talking about her education. And I think she looks beautiful. Not that she needs to look beautiful. She looks strong and she looks powerful. And I think that's the message that we should be sending, not a girl in pink. Even though I love the color pink, she shouldn't be reading a medical terminology book upside down. So thank you. Thanks for listening tonight. Thanks for joining me.